We were walking through Bologna on holiday in Italy when an older woman suddenly stopped beside our stroller. Our son was 5 months old, lying on his stomach with his head lifted in the bassinet on the stroller, looking out at everything around him. And she reacted as though she had seen the most precious thing in the world. She said something to Martin and I in Italian that we didn't understand and put her hand near her chest and honestly looked as though she might start crying. The whole interaction probably lasted 15 seconds, but I kept thinking about it afterwards because it captured something I had quietly wondered about before we had even left Germany for our vacation. We already know what it's like to go through public life as two dads here in Germany, and I grew up in the United States. I also have a pretty clear sense of how differently our family might be perceived depending on where we are there. Italy was more of a question mark. It is a country where children are famously included in everyday life, and people are often very warm and expressive. But politically and legally, families like ours do not have the same equality they have in Germany. Italy recognizes same-sex civil unions rather than equal marriage, and its laws around surrogacy have become even more restrictive in recent years. So I genuinely did wonder which version of Italy we were going to encounter once people saw two men traveling with a 5-month-old baby and no mother anywhere nearby. Would people stare at us? Would they try to work out who we are? Or would we feel that subtle pressure to explain our family that sometimes appears even when nobody says anything directly? As it turned out, being two dads was probably the easiest thing about the trip. The things that actually occupied our minds were whether our son was drinking enough during a 38 degrees Celsius heat wave, whether the pavement had become too hot for a Labrador to walk on, and whether we had completely underestimated what happens when you put a baby, a large dog, two adults, and everything they apparently need into a minivan for 2 weeks. I want to come back to the contrast between Italy's political reality and the warmth we experience from ordinary people, because for me, that became the most interesting part of the trip. But the reason those interactions meant so much was also that the practical side of traveling as a new family demanded far more attention than I had expected. We had reached a point where we finally felt comfortable enough to try a proper holiday because we had taken our son into Munich often enough that leaving the house no longer felt completely unpredictable. We knew when he normally slept, and we had worked out how to manage going to cafés and restaurants, and we were beginning to trust that if he became restless, one of us would probably be able to solve it without the entire outing collapsing. That gave us enough confidence to plan a road trip through northern Italy, beginning in South Tyrol and continuing through Verona, Bologna, and Treviso. We had been to Italy multiple times before and love it so much. It's so close to Bavaria. So the country itself was familiar, but we had never experienced it with a baby, and adding our dog to that equation meant that almost every decision had to satisfy several different needs at once. We ended up staying exclusively in Airbnbs because we needed a place that accepted dogs, had reliable air conditioning, offered some sort of parking situation, and ideally we wanted a separate bedroom so we could put our travel cot in there, and when our son fell asleep, we could still talk and not have to spend the rest of the evening silently staying in a dark hotel room. A hotel might have worked for a night, but for 2 weeks it would have made evenings much more difficult. Then there was the minivan, which was not exactly the vehicle I would choose for driving through historic cities in Italy, but there was really no alternative for us. When you put a large Labrador into a proper crate and the baby into a rear-facing car seat, most of the vehicle is already occupied with us also being in it. And then when you add the travel crib, formula, bottles, dog food, diapers, toys, and the clothing that we needed to bring for 2 weeks, we generally thought that it was reasonable, but until we had to unpack it all, oh, that was a nightmare. And we had made many driving mistakes through Italy before. We know that you cannot just type the center of an Italian city on a GPS and hope for the best. So this time we had to be much more careful. We used the app Gemini to help us identify larger parking areas outside of the restricted traffic zones and check whether the walk into the city would be manageable with a stroller. And that actually worked very well. Most Italian cities have places where you can leave the car outside of the historic center and walk in quite easily, provided you know where you are going before you arrive. The one truly stressful driving experience did not happen on a narrow city street at all. It happened at one of our Airbnbs, which advertised that it included a parking space and a parking garage, but did not show exactly how you reached it. The underground garage was at the bottom of a very steep incline, and while that car was on the steep section, then there was a sharp turn once you got down. And getting down had already felt super uncomfortable, and I think the van scraped the bottom of the road when we entered. And so we knew that getting out was going to be much, much harder. We decided immediately that the baby and the dog should not be in the vehicle when we attempted to get out. So I stayed in the apartment upstairs with both of them, and Martin went down alone. I remember just sitting there waiting longer than expected, knowing how difficult the entrance had looked and becoming increasingly nervous because I could not see what was happening. I actually did hear the tires skidding a bit, and Martin later told me that he had to create enough momentum to get the car to go up on two-wheel drive, and also managing that curve that's also on the incline. So whenever he lost momentum kind of on the curve and it started backing down towards the wall, he freaked out, of course, and thought he was going to crash the car, and said that he almost did. And I could just see how shaken he was. And it may have been our favorite Airbnb on the trip, but I just know that had we known about that parking situation, we honestly would not have ended up staying there. So although parking was not the center of our trip, it did teach us that parking included is not enough information when you're traveling with a large vehicle. You really need to know what entering and leaving that space looks like, because what an Italian host considers accessible by car may be based on a very different car than the one you were bringing. Can also be true about winding and difficult roads going up a hill, which we also had. So we kind of had it all. The challenge that shaped mostly our thoughts about every day was the heat wave. The hottest day reached around 38 degrees Celsius, and suddenly we were thinking about situations in which we had never really been confronted before. We wondered whether our son was getting enough fluid, whether the ground was safe for our dog to walk on, and what we could do if the car broke down while we were between cities with both of them. We had researched how other parents managed Southern European summers with young babies, and before the trip we gradually began moving our son's bedtime later and also putting him in the travel cot before we left. At home in Germany, he normally went to sleep at around 7 p.m., and I had initially assumed that this would mean that every day in Italy, we would need to be back by 6 p.m. because we would need to get back, bathe him, feed him, and settle him down for the night. Instead, moving his bedtime later allowed him to sleep slightly later in the morning as well, and it completely changed what the trip could look like. We would usually leave the apartment around 9 a.m. and the cities were still relatively cool. We spent the morning walking, having coffee, or maybe having an early lunch. And by 12 or 1, when the heat became much more intense, we went back inside and stayed in the air conditioning until roughly 5 or 6 p.m. And I would love to describe this as a relaxing Italian siesta where all four of us slept peacefully. But most days our son slept while Martin and I prepared bottles, dealt with the dog, or laying there hoping that we might also be able to fall asleep before he gets up. But somehow either him or the dog needed us again. So even though we were somewhere cool during that weather, that mattered more than whether the afternoon felt particularly restful. At around 6, we would go back out and stay in the city until 9 or sometimes later. Our son occasionally slept in the stroller during that time, but often he was completely awake, watching people, taking in the movement around him. And because we chose busy outdoor cafes and casual restaurants, It never felt as though one small sound from him would disrupt an entire room. We were not taking a 5-month-old into a silent, intimate osteria and expecting him to appreciate that atmosphere. So we went to places with street noise, other families, and general activity that he could simply be there with us. And that's also where I began noticing one of the clearest differences between Italy and the places I knew better. Nobody seemed surprised to have a baby outside at 8:30 in the evening. Families were still sitting together, children were moving between tables, babies were in strollers while their parents finished dinner or had a drink. And when Martin and I one night ordered a glass of wine with our son sitting beside us, I never had the feeling that somebody was quietly evaluating whether responsible parents should still be out at that hour. Children seemed much more naturally integrated into adult life, especially once the temperature began to fall in the evening, and that made us feel more relaxed as well. Germany has generally been very welcoming to us as parents, so I do not want to manufacture a dramatic conflict that we have not experienced. But in Italy, the inclusion of children felt more visible and more expressive. In parts of the United States, having a baby out later in the evening or drinking a glass of wine beside one might attract more judgment, although my experience also depends enormously on the region and the people around you. Italy felt as though the basic assumption was that children belong wherever family life is happening. And as long as the parents were taking care of them, nobody needed to make it into a larger discussion. Just as we had settled into that rhythm, our son began teething. His first two lower teeth in the middle started pushing through during the trip, and almost without any warning, the way he drank his bottles changed. Before that, we could normally prepare a bottle and expect him to finish most of it, perhaps returning to the last bit a little later, but he sometimes drank much less at a time and occasionally seemed to lose interest altogether. We had honestly assumed that the heat would make him want to drink more, so when the opposite happened, it made us far more nervous than it might have under normal circumstances. We were paying really close attention to his wet diapers, how alert he was, and whether his mood or energy changed, and we noticed that he often compensated by drinking more at night. He remained interested in everything around him and never showed us a change that made us feel like we needed to seek medical help or something. But of course, being in another country makes every concern slightly louder because your usual support system is suddenly much further away. At home, we know where the pediatrician is, we know where to find whatever we might need, and we understand how everything works. Whereas on a trip, you're always adding the question of what would you do if a situation became more serious. We kept him out of direct sunlight. We had a little small USB fan when it seemed helpful, and treated the air conditioning afternoons as non-negotiable. Ironically, we may have been better equipped for the heat wave in Italy than if we had been at our own house in Germany. I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US, where air conditioning was simply a part of daily life. But when I moved to Germany during a heat wave in 2015, I quickly learned that German buildings and German habits approach summer very differently. You open the windows while the air is cool, close the shutters before the heat arrives, and create airflow wherever possible. And most of the time, the strategies really do help. But with a young baby and a large dog who also hates the heat, I was extremely grateful for every Airbnb we had booked that had proper air conditioning. It meant that no matter how hot the morning became, we always had somewhere safe and genuinely cool to return to. While we were dealing with the heat and bottles, Italy also kept showing us in small ways how easily both our dog and our baby could become a part of everyday public life. One morning in Bologna, I ran into kind of like a small stay cafe, like where you just order, there's not a server, and ordered 2 croissants and 2 espressos for us, and then carried everything outside to where Martin was sitting with our son and our dog. And about 5 minutes later, the cashier noticed through the window that there was a dog with us, And we had not asked for anything. And like I said, there was no server that normally just might have brought water over. But she disappeared for a moment and came outside with just like a plastic food container full of water and placed it beside him with a smile and went back inside. It was such a simple gesture that she, of course, probably never thought about again. But it stuck with me. And, we didn't need special treatment or anything when we were there, but we were allowed to still be there. Similar things happened throughout the trip. Water often arrived without us asking, and our dog received a steady supply of bello, bello, and bellissimo, which is probably very good for not only his confidence, but our confidence. Germany is dog friendly, particularly compared with much of the experience I had growing up in the US. But at home, I sometimes feel like we first need to ask whether something is acceptable. While in Italy, it is often seemed to just have been accepted before we even considered asking. That is only our experience from these places and these 2 weeks, not a definitive ranking of entire countries, but the consistency was striking. The reaction to our son was even warmer. Waiters would come over with coffee and then spend longer smiling at him than speaking to us. People walking past the stroller would stop and say something in Italian or make expressive gestures that we did, that didn't require translation. And the older woman from the beginning of the video, that was the most emotional example, but she was not the only person that seemed genuinely delighted that a baby was there. And that changed the way I felt as a parent, because our son did not seem like someone we had brought into adult space and now needed to manage so perfectly that nobody would notice him. He was simply a part of that cafe, the street, the evening, and people seemed happy to interact with him. The warmth we experience in Germany can be quieter. A person may smile, make a small comment, and continue with their day, whereas in Italy, people were more likely to stop and allow the interaction to become a moment of its own. That difference also brought me back to the question underneath the whole trip, which was whether people understood that Martin and I were both his fathers. We certainly stood out. Martin is extremely tall. I'm also tall by Italian standards. Our dog is a large Labrador who enjoys being noticed, loves everyone, and we were clearly sharing all the things that come with caring for a 5-month-old. We took turns feeding him, pushing the stroller, holding him when he became restless. So I assume that at least some people worked out the family relationship. Others may have thought we were brothers, friends, or relatives, and assumed a mother was somewhere nearby. But there's no way for us to know what every stranger believed. What we actually experienced was that the question never seemed to become a problem. We met Airbnb hosts, sat in cafes every day, and spent long evenings in public without either of us feeling that we needed to clarify who we were. After a few days, I realized that I had largely stopped wondering what everyone else thought because the behavior had given me no reason to keep analyzing it. And that is where the political connection became impossible for me to ignore. Our holiday does not tell us what daily life is like for an Italian rainbow family dealing with schools, documents, legal recognition, and all the systems that visitors never need to encounter. Italy still gives same-sex couples civil unions rather than marriage, and since December 2024, Italian citizens can be persecuted under Italian law for pursuing surrogacy abroad, even where it is legal. Those realities matter, especially to the families who have to live with them, and 2 welcoming weeks on vacation do not cancel them out. At the same time, the ordinary people we encountered could have hardly treated us with more warmth, and I think both of those things needed to be allowed to exist in the same story. A government can make life more difficult for families like ours, while individual people continue responding to that actual family standing in front of them with curiosity, affection, or complete normality. I also found myself thinking about masculinity because that is the one difference I noticed repeatedly between the United States and Europe. In Italy, men often appear much more comfortable with expressing physical warmth towards each other, Male friends or relatives can greet each other with a kiss on the cheek without immediately becoming anxious what someone might think about it or infer from it. Whereas growing up in the American South, I remember much more pressure on men to avoid anything that could be interpreted as insufficiently masculine or possibly gay. Living in Germany had already begun changing my understanding of that, and Italy showed me another version of the same thing. It does not automatically make a country more progressive on LGBTQ plus rights, as the legal situation clearly demonstrates, but it may create a social environment where two men moving through public life together do not feel unusual or as threatening to traditional ideas about masculinity. I cannot prove that this influenced how people saw us, and I would not like to make a sweeping conclusion from a 2-week trip, but the feeling I came home with was that we had been visible without being examined. That distinction matters because it allowed us to stop thinking about ourselves as a special family situation and focus instead on the things every parent thinks about during a holiday. Whether the baby will sleep, whether the dog has found enough shade, and whether we can finish our drinks before somebody needs us again. So, would we do the trip again? Absolutely. We would still choose Airbnbs with a separate bedroom. We would continue treating air conditioning as essential during a summer trip with a young baby. We would have asked more specific questions about the parking, perhaps request a photo of the ramp considering we had a minivan, and we would definitely bring fewer clothes. We would also keep the later schedules because organizing our days around the heat allowed us to enjoy the cities rather than spending the entire evening trapped inside. More than anything, the trip gave us confidence because it showed us that traveling with a baby did not require everything to go exactly as planned. Our son began teething and changing his feeding habits, the temperatures became extreme, and one parking garage briefly made us question all of our life decisions. But we adjusted each time and just continued. When I think back now, the practical stress is not what comes first to mind. I remember that cashier bringing water outside for our dog without being asked. Or, yeah, the cute waiter kind of smiling at our son, and the feeling of sitting in an Italian piazza in the evening while children and families are still everywhere around us. Most of all, I remember the older woman in Bologna stopping in the middle of whatever she had been doing because our little boy made her emotional for a few seconds. Before we left Germany, I thought I was going to Italy partly to discover how another culture would see our family, but I came home realizing that most of the people we encountered did not seem particularly interested in figuring us out. They responded to the baby, they included the dog, and they allowed us to participate in everyday life without turning our family into a question that needed an answer. Being welcomed on holiday is not the same as being granted equal rights, and I do not want to confuse those things. But ordinary human warmth still matters. For 2 weeks in northern Italy, we did not feel like a political debate. We felt like a family on vacation. Admittedly, a very sweaty family traveling with too much luggage. We had to get out of the car every few days, but a family nonetheless. If you have ever traveled somewhere that surprised you with how comfortable or uncomfortable it felt to be there as a family, I would genuinely love to hear your story and about that experience in the comments. And if you're new here, my name is Robert, this is Papaarade, and together with my husband Martin, we document what life actually looks like raising our son in Germany while also exploring the cultural differences I notice as an American who made Germany home. If that sounds like a perspective you would like to follow, we would love to have you subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.